Okay, let us go ahead and get started. So first, a quick note to the undergraduates. Thank you so much for your first papers. I enjoyed them tremendously. I'll be returning them very soon with comments. And relatedly, you will be getting the second paper prompt. That one is not due until after spring break. Let me say a couple of words about it. The first is, as you've already seen, it is as open-ended as the first one, basically write about something we've been talking about. As always, you are welcome to write at greater or lesser length. We leave these page limits on either end quite literally, so we do not look lesser on a shorter paper. We just want these as thought exercises. In terms of that due date, we often debate, should we have it due before or after spring break? We decided the best thing to do is we will assign the due date to be after spring break. You are welcome to turn it in anytime. We will happily read it anytime. So if you'd like to get it done before the break, great. If you would like to wait until the deadline, that is fine too. For those of you who are not undergraduates, of course, this does not apply to you. However, we hope that you are doing that same work, engaging with these readings, which we know are far-flung temporally and spatially, but we hope they are opening up tons of possibilities in terms of your thinking. Any questions, at first from the undergraduates about the papers, but also from all of you more generally? Great. Well, then today we will continue, and it's one of our huge themes of this course, how different figures have reread and reinterpreted these earlier prophetic movements. So we've begun tracing that history of rereading and reinterpretation in Christianity. We looked at the rethinking that occurred in early modern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet another rereading that we're rather critical of, as it's played out in contemporary ethics and the analytic tradition, as represented by people like Parfit. We've begun to point toward the rereadings that will occur in the Romantic tradition, and we'll be discussing those at great length next week. Last week, of course, we then turned to the Upanishads and Buddhism, looking at the salvation prophetic movements that were so extraordinary. And today, we, of course, as you know, turn to Schopenhauer, this extraordinary figure from, of all places, 19th century Europe, who gives an incredibly powerful rereading of both Upanishads and Buddhism. And as always, we'll think philosophically about the great powers and perhaps the dangers of that form of rereading, and hopefully allow you to continue the work of how you want to reread and reinterpret these traditions. To do so, let me hand things over to Roberto.
So I'm going to begin today's class by making some remarks about Schopenhauer's philosophy and his views about the conduct of life. Next week, we reach the midpoint of our course. This is the 5th class. I think we have only 11 classes. One of the functions of my remarks today is to return to some of the conceptual categories that we've been using to distinguish the orientations and the different approaches to the conduct of life, and use Schopenhauer for that purpose. Now let me start by rehearsing some contrasts in philosophy and moral philosophy, with most of which we've dealt, but with some of which we haven't dealt yet. The first is the contrast that Henri Bergson, a French philosopher of the early 20th century, drew between two kinds of ethics: the ethics of obligation and the ethics of aspiration. The ethics of obligation is about our duties to one another, what we owe one another, and the ethics of obligation is about the form of life to which we should try to ascend, the direction, the goal. The ethics of obligation is exemplified by the school philosophy, which we discussed a few weeks ago. And Schopenhauer is very definitely on the side of the ethics of aspiration. Nothing about the book of accounts of our debts to one another or liabilities. That's not his focus. The second contrast is between two approaches to happiness, because our moral ideas have always, in every culture, been associated in one way or another with conceptions of happiness. Not to say that each ethical approach is a view of happiness, but to say its view of happiness is always one of its defining presuppositions. And with respect to happiness, there are again two main families of approaches in the history of our moral ideas. Happiness is sometimes viewed as negatively as a negation of suffering, a state in which we do not suffer or suffer less. By contrast to the other family of views in which happiness is viewed as fullness of activity. And fullness of activity, the development of a form of life and of a series of capabilities and experiences, almost invariably implies conflict and contradiction. If not among people, within the individual, and therefore also must allow for suffering. Because with contradiction and conflict, even if it's conflict within the self, comes suffering, but suffering is then allowed because it's the price of a greater form of being, a higher form of life, with more intensity, more scope, more capability. Now, third, in the history of philosophy, we pointed out early in the course that there are two main traditions, the dominant traditions in the global history of philosophy. And these are, first, the Greek philosophy of being, which continues in one form or another up to this day in 20th century physics. And this view is a view that takes as a touchstone of reality what's most real in the world as the basic constituents of the world, the elementary structure of the world, and the constants, the laws, symmetries and constants, the regularities that govern this basic structure. So what's most real in the world for this tradition, which begins in Greek philosophy, Greek metaphysics, and which we could call also by the name the Greek philosophy of being, are these fundamental structures of reality. And the symmetries, constants, and laws that govern them. This has been always, for more than 2,000 years, the dominant philosophical tradition in the West. And it's especially associated with the great Greek metaphysicians, especially Aristotle. The second major tradition in the global history of philosophy is what we would call speculative monism. It's the idea that all the changes and distinctions in the world are superficial. They're epiphenomenal. That's what is most real in the world, and the subject, the ultimate target of both inquiry and aspiration is the timeless one. Reality is ultimately unified and timeless. There are qualified and unqualified forms of speculative monism. What we have in Schopenhauer is a radical form of speculative monism, which is also represented in the dominant philosophical traditions of ancient India, in the Upanishads as well as in Schopenhauer. Now, these are not the only two global traditions of philosophy, but they have been by far the most influential. And they have something in common, despite the appearance that they're radically opposed to one another. What they have in common is the association of reality with timelessness. For both of them, even though they seem to contrast so radically, what is most real is what is least touched by time. There's a third tradition, but it's much weaker than these two, which we could call temporal naturalism, and which says everything is time-bound, everything is transient, everything is ephemeral, but no less real on that account. And we see this in some of the sciences, in natural history, for example, which does not presuppose a timeless typology of natural kind, or in the case of evolution, species. And admits the idea even that the regularities co-evolve together with the transient natural kinds of species. So we do not need to think, for example, that the laws of Mendelian genetics existed before life emerged, as if they were waiting in the sky to be enacted in natural reality. Now, third, Schopenhauer exemplifies a classical conception of philosophy, which we described earlier in the course as a super science above all the specialized disciplines, professing to describe and explain what the world is. This was the province of metaphysics. And Schopenhauer is a very complete exemplification of this idea of philosophy. The super science was not merely theoretical. The super science was practical. The super science was enlisted in the service of a form of self-help. And we can't understand its historical power without taking into account this practical intention, which was intimately allied with its overwhelming theoretical ambition. Self-help against what? Self-help against the incurable flaws in the human condition, which we early described as mortality, groundlessness, and insatiability, to which we could add our susceptibility to belittlement. Schopenhauer illustrates radically this large conception of philosophy, as opposed to what came later in the history of philosophy, in the 19th and especially the 20th century, which were a series of deflationary conceptions of philosophy, reducing its level of both theoretical and practical ambition, as, for example, in analytical philosophy in the Anglo-American world in the recent century. Now, fourth, let's locate Schopenhauer in relation to the major approaches to the conduct of life that we've started to explore. And one of the classifications through which we view these approaches to the conduct of life is the contrast between approaches that could be labeled as struggling with the world, overcoming the world, and humanizing the world. So the struggle with the world can be sacred or profane. It can involve religious belief or not. And the most important example in the history of our ideas about ourselves and our situation is the theology of the Semitic monotheisms. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which see our life as enveloped in a larger transaction of dramatic encounters between God and humanity, and call us to join God in a faithful struggle to change the world and to change ourselves. And there are these secular forms of the struggle with the world, intimately associated with the world revolutionary project that has inflamed humanity for the last few centuries. There's a narrative of transformation of society and of transformation of the self, sometimes without any link to religious belief, but with the same fundamental idea that there's a story of transformation. A story of transformation which ends in an elevation of humanity, in our elevation to a higher form of life. Then second, there are approaches that we could describe as overcoming the world. Overcoming the world is also overcoming the will. And the overcoming of the world is to free ourselves from the appearances and from the work of the blind will, the tyranny of desire. And we see this approach dominant in the philosophy of ancient India, with repercussions throughout the world in many places, including China. And represented in the West by Schopenhauer, among others. Then the third approach to the conduct of life, we can call it humanizing the world. And its most canonical, important representative is ancient Confucianism. Rather than the philosophical, metaphysical Confucianism of later Chinese history, is in the Sung Dynasty, the Neo-Confucianism of the Sung Dynasty. And this approach to the conduct of life, we could label an anti-metaphysical metaphysic. It says, we didn't make the world does not belong to us. and we may not be able to understand it, surrounded by darkness. But in this dark and meaningless cosmos, we human beings can create meaning. We can mobilize part of nature, of the forces of nature, to our advantage, and we can put our stamp on a world which would otherwise have no communication with our intimate concerns. The humanization of the world. Now, what is the relation between the idea that there are two global traditions of philosophy, the Greek philosophy of being, or the philosophy of deep structure, you could call it, and the speculative monism, and this triple classification of the approaches to the conduct of life. The first classification is the classification of metaphysical ideas. The second classification is the classification of approaches to how to live. The two classifications meet only in one place. They meet in the second place of the classification of the approaches to life. The speculative monism is uniquely associated with the overcoming of the will and of the world. What about the other two approaches to the conduct of life? There is no one-to-one relation between the overcoming, between the struggle with the world in either sacred or secular form, and one of those two dominant philosophical orientations. Christian theology, for example, as well as Jewish and Muslim theology, during the Middle Ages at least, gave a central role to the influence of Aristotle and the Greek philosophy of being. Even though we might think that the Greek philosophy of being would be completely inappropriate to be the philosophical ally of the struggle with the world in its sacred form. A 20th century philosopher, Heidegger, said, if one day I wrote a theology, the word being would never occur in it, because he thought that the idea of the Greek philosophy of being, that the impersonal being is higher than the personal, is incompatible with Christianity, as it would be incompatible with the other Semitic religions. A crucial tenet of those religions, the Semitic monotheisms, is that the encounter, the confrontation between humanity and God takes place in the category of personality. The relations between God and humanity are analogized to the relations among people. And similarly, there is no relation between the humanization of the world, especially the Confucianist form, which is its canonical form, and one of those two dominant traditions of philosophy. So this is a source of confusion. in that middle position, or that second position, of the overcoming of the world and the will, where we see a clear alliance between speculative monism, the philosophical position, and the overcoming of the world and the will, the practical position. So Schopenhauer represents the clearest, most radical instantiation, the example of this marriage of the metaphysical idea of the timeless one as the ultimate reality, with the practical commitment to the overcoming of the world and the will. This position in the history of philosophy is perennially encouraged, inspired by a series of recurrent experiences that we all have. The first experience is the experience of the transience of everything. We see everything around us as disappearing. The second experience is the experience of the treadmill of desire, insatiability, one of the incurable flaws in the human experience. We're tied to a machine which binds us to desire, satiation, boredom, and more desire, forever, on and on, relentlessly. And the third experience is the experience of the universality of our mental experience. We have this experience of being able to communicate with other human beings. And no society, no culture is ever so alien that we cannot hope to understand it from within as well as from outside. And this experience of intimate mental experience and of our purchase of it, our access to it, also perpetually renews the idea of speculative monism, the central proposition. Now we come to the second part of my remarks, which is then about Schopenhauer himself, his doctrine. And let's distinguish those remarks into three parts. First, his general metaphysical view, his version of speculative monism. Second, his picture of the human condition, our circumstance in the world. And third, the implications for the conduct of life, the ethical orientation that he recommends. Do you have a question?
The experiences are experiences of what? Sorry, I missed there's three experiences tied to.
Could you speak more louder? Turn on your microphone.
Can you hear me? Yeah. When you spoke about the experiences, I was wondering if these are experiences of just the human being, or if it was, I missed the second part of it.
Experiences of?
The three experiences that you just mentioned?
Oh, the experiences we have that would lead to the thinking of
Yes, so these orientations to life, to the conduct of life, struggling with the world, either in sacred or profane form, overcoming the world, and humanizing the world are permanent options in the history of humanity. So, that's why Schopenhauer is so remarkable and so interesting. These are not like fashions or ideas that were temporarily available to humanity. The idea of speculative monism, the basics of philosophy like Schopenhauer, can be attractive to human beings anywhere, anytime. So this is not something that we encounter in other departments of thought. It's a unique characteristic of these fundamental approaches. And it's also one of the ways to study them, one of the reasons to study them. So first, the basic metaphysical idea of Schopenhauer. It starts from a fundamental proposition. There's only one thing in the world that we can know both from the inside and from the outside. And that's us. That's humanity. We know it from the outside because we can see our own bodies in the world. We are part of the furniture of the universe. But we also know ourselves in another way from the inside. We have this experience of life, of vitality, of desire, which is blind and overwhelming. And the fundamental metaphysical move in Schopenhauer is the generalization of this dual aspect theory, knowing from the outside and knowing from the inside, to the whole world. That is, the move in Schopenhauer to say, we can see the whole world in the same dual way in which we see ourselves. So long as we identify with the world in the spirit of the philosophy of speculative monism. As we see the world as being pushed forward, impelled, burned by this basic blind impulse Spinoza had called conatus. So this move is largely unargued or not discriminately argued in Schopenhauer. It's developed by him in a very attractive form. But I don't think we can really say that it's supported by any very persuasive set of arguments. The most supportive arguments come from the results of viewing the world in this form. See the whole world as we see ourselves, with this central animating impulse to life, to reproduction, to continuation. The most important feature of the world is that it is what it is rather than something else. We can't deduce its characteristics from anything. We can't rationally reconstruct it. So Schopenhauer describes it as a blinding, burning reality. Now then comes the description of the human circumstance. And a good way to begin understanding Schopenhauer's idea of the human being is to return to those two metaphors. I think the second one we haven't mentioned so far, but the first one is the metaphor of the porcupines. They huddle together in the cold night to warm each other. Then they prick each other with their spines, and and they separate. They go back and forth in the cold night until they settle in an uncomfortable middle distance. The other metaphor, the one that I don't think we mentioned yet, is the metaphor of people in a rowboat on the ocean in a storm. They huddle together like the porcupines huddle in the dark, in the sea. Description of our situation. We're frightened and we come together. Now let me read you two paragraphs from Schopenhauer. They both come from the same chapter of The World as Will and Representation, his masterwork. Chapter 46 of Part 2. And they give you a very accurate sense of what his conception of our condition is. The first passage. This world is the battleground of tormented and agonized beings who continue to exist only by devouring each other. Every beast of prey in the world, is the living grave of thousands of others. And its self-maintenance is a chain of torturing deaths. However, an optimist tells me to open my eyes and look at the world and see how beautiful it is in the sunshine. With its mountains, valleys, rivers, plants, animals, and so on. But is the world then a peep show? These things are certainly beautiful to behold, but to be them is something quite different. So the world is beautiful to look at, but it's terrible to be. Insofar as it's dominated by this blind, cruel force, which is the will. The will, in Schopenhauer's metaphysics, is not this insatiable desire. Insatiable desire is the outward form. The will is the reality. Is the intimate nature, is the blind reality, the blind conatus, the impulse to life, to perpetuation. And it is most dramatically manifest in the sexual impulse. So, Schopenhauer's descriptions of sexual desire are some of the most astonishing parts of his writing, coming long before Darwin and Freud. He says, for example, after one of his discussions of the sexual impulse, after copulation, we can hear the devil laugh. A merciless remark of Schopenhauer is completely characteristic. Now let me read you the second passage. Awaken to life out of the night of unconsciousness. The will finds itself as an individual in an endless and boundless world, among innumerable individuals, all striving, suffering, and erring. And as if through a troubled dream, it hurries back to the old unconsciousness. Yet till then, its desires are unlimited. its claims inexhaustible, and every satisfied desire gives birth to a new one. No possible satisfaction in the world could suffice to still its craving, set a final goal to its demands, and fill the bottomless pit of its heart. That's Schopenhauer. And what then are the ethical implications of the conduct, for the conduct of life, of this view of our situation in the world? What are the antidotes? What's the escape route? There are three main escapes that Schopenhauer proposes. The first is asceticism, mortification, to turn on the will and contain it. It's this insatiable desire. The second is detachment. So this is the reason why Schopenhauer reveres art, because he sees art as the principal way, or at least one of the ways, in which we separate our understanding of the world from desire, and are able to look at the world without having a practical interest to get something. And he even takes this to the level of absurdity when he remarks that that's why children are so happy, because they have a detached view of the world. That remark, I remember in an earlier conversation of ours, showing in this way his complete lack of acquaintance with children, but revealing the character, the idea. And the third antidote to the suffering is holiness. And here let me remind you of the comment that we made before. That it's interesting that the mystical countercurrents within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam embrace the speculative monism. So the dominant philosophical position of the theologians in those three religions was the Greek philosophy of being. They all called Maimonides, Al-Farabi, Thomas Aquinas, they call Aristotle the philosopher. Even though, as I argued before, the Greek philosophy of being seems to contradict the direction or the tenets of those religions. And in those religions, what accompanied the Greek philosophy of being was not some version of temporal naturalism, the idea that everything is ephemeral, but no less real on that account. But accompanied it was speculative monism, which also seems to contradict the spiritual direction of those religions. The Jewish mystics, the Christian mystics, and the Muslim mystics all embrace speculative monism in one form or another. So, the holiness is our identification with all creatures, with the whole world, because the whole world is ultimately all the same thing. So the basis of this idea, you could call either a universal altruism or or a universal egoism. Because the idea is that the principle of distinction between things and self and among selves is illusory. We're all the same. Schopenhauer's emphasis is not on the practical altruistic effects. Schopenhauer's emphasis is on the affirmation of our unity, on the metaphysical idea. Now, Schopenhauer is famously known as the philosopher of pessimism. And I want to conclude these remarks by saying something about this view of pessimism. And as I have before, I want to make my point by recalling a very old joke about Leibniz. It goes back to Leibniz's own time. Leibniz was ridiculed by Voltaire as Panglossian philosopher, radical optimism, because he was associated in the popularizations of his ideas with the slogan that this is the best of all possible worlds. And the joke is the following. The optimist and the pessimist. Who is the optimist? He is the one who says, this is the best of all possible worlds. Well, that's Leibniz. And who is the pessimist? He is the one who says, that's right. So the point of this joke, which was told at Leibniz's expense, is the argument that optimism and pessimism are essentially equivalent because they are both ironic and contemplative attitudes. They're not the attitudes of the agent. The agent is not either an optimist or a pessimist. The agent can be hopeful. And hope is the third position. Hope is neither optimism nor pessimism. Hope is the shadow that accompanies action. We act in the world, we transform, we struggle, and then our struggle produces hope. Hope is not the antecedent or cause of action. Hope is the consequence of transformative action. So there's the situation. We have the optimist and the pessimist arguing with one another, with each other. And having this argument about these approaches to the conduct of life. Now, can we argue about the approaches to the conduct of life? I think we can argue. There are at least three sets of arguments that we can make in favor of one or another approach. To what extent does it agree or conflict with what we independently know to be the fact about the world or about ourselves? To what extent does it resonate with our deepest longings, the second category of argument? And to the extent that every set of these philosophical ideas about the conduct of life is a self-fulfilling promise, is the promise kept or broken? As each one of these approaches to the conduct of life says in effect, follow me and you'll make the world more like what I believe it is. But the world fights back. So the promise is delivered, but what happens when we try to implement the promise? Does the promise sustain itself? Does it keep itself, as it were? Or does it destabilize itself? So these are the kinds of arguments we can make for and against one of these approaches to life. But the argument is never concluded, because although the question is the most important question, the question from which no one can escape, the answers given to the question, which are these answers that we see in the world history of our moral ideas, can never be conclusively justified. There seems to be an irreparable disproportion between the weight of the question and the power of the answer to the justification. And that's what we call before the cognitive gap. So it's not a reason for despair, because we can continue to argue, but it is a reason for not believing in the adequacy of a purely rational approach. And thus, the argument for hope and transformation. While the pessimist and the optimist are arguing with each other, the hopeful one, the third one, intervenes and attempts to transform things in a certain way, in the hope that then the idea of the options will change. And they continue arguing, the optimist, the pessimist, and the hopeful one, until their time runs out.
Wonderful. Let us open this up for discussion. Thoughts? Yes, please.
So would you say that the cognitive gap is what allows the hopeful one to enter the conversation?
What allows the hopeful one to enter the conversation.
Yeah. If we see the cognitive gap.
I think the hopeful one doesn't need that excuse to enter the conversation. But the existence of the cognitive gap helps us understand why the hopeful one has an opportunity or a chance. That he has a chance to change the reality of the options, to add something to the debate, because otherwise the discussion would go on forever. So I think I think one of the deepest points here about moral psychology is the point about the nature of hope. So hope, optimism and pessimism are descriptions of the world. And Goethe said, the non-agent is always a fatalist. The position of being passive, an observer of the world, leads to contemplation, irony, and fatalism. The perspective of hope is the perspective of action. So, optimism and pessimism are alternative descriptions. And the point of the argument about Leibniz, the joke about Leibniz, is that actually, surprisingly, they're in a sense equivalent. But hope is an existential orientation, inseparable from action. And hope is the source of hope. Action is the source of hope, transformative action. So it's related to this idea that we can see these moral orientations as self-fulfilling prophecies to some extent. Each of these orientations to life that we're examining is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And they are rival self-fulfilling prophecies. So they say in effect, follow me and you'll make the world and the human situation more like what I say it is. Now what happens when we actually follow them? Will they sustain themselves? Will these promises keep themselves, or will they break themselves? The perspective of the agent is to change the situation in a certain direction. So it's not as if he's just intervening, the hopeful one, to make you believe something different. He's actually trying to change the reality in some way, and to resolve the situation by changing the reality. So it's not a bet about what the world already is. It's a bet about what the world can become. So it's not at the same level. Now, I think that in some way that's related to this earlier point that we made earlier in the course, when we were speaking about Christianity. That what is most important in a moral striving, the first demand, the first imperative, is to throw away your shield, to throw down your shield, to unprotect yourself, to make yourself vulnerable. Remember the distinction between altruism and love. One of the fundamental distinctions is that the price of love is vulnerability. The price of altruism is not vulnerability. And vulnerability then allows for transformation, for surprise, is the perspective of hope. Vulnerability, love, hope are not on the same plane as these fatalistic and contemplative and ironical moral postures. That's the kind of claim that's being made about these alternative moral ideas. Yes.
How would you say hope can avoid becoming naive if it's not tempered by a realism or also some version of optimism or pessimism based on an assessment of reality?
Of course there has to be hope can't be a catch-all excuse for abandoning the struggle to determine what's realistic. Right? But consider it in a political context. So how do we assess realism? Well, one of the obstacles to programmatic experiments and programmatic ideas in the world is a false notion of transformation. So we think the Marxist idea of transformation is there's a binary view of politics. We either have the management of a system, Marx called them the modes of production, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, or we have the systemic substitution of one system for another. So in the world, many of the institutionally conservative social democrats who run countries, who govern countries, are disillusioned revolutionaries. So the way they think is, Real change would be revolutionary change. Now, that's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left for us to do? What's left for us to do is to humanize the world, to rationalize it, to reconstruct. So that suggests the importance of insisting on the possibility of fragmentary change. Because real structural change in history is almost always fragmentary. It happens part by part and step by step. Every partial change can either be a step to a further change or can be an excuse for not taking a further change. That's the ambiguity of the real thing. So that's what I would say happens in politics. And what your question just now is about the moral equivalent to that political experience. It's the same thing in morality. Transformation is, if we have an idea of total transformation, it's an invitation to failure, to despondency, to disillusionment. There has to be the moral equivalent to fragmentary structural reform. So realism, I think, must be the ally of hope. The realism lies in abandoning a perfectionist ideal in the moral realm as we would in the political realm. And therefore invites us to experiment. Does that make sense, that analogy between the moral
It
and
does. I
the...
mean, what about the ethical aspirations for something like world peace or brotherly love, which some people are determined to hold on to these, even though there's, of course, a lot of evidence that speculative is feasible given human nature. So that's another form of which the hope is somewhat in tension with.
Why? Because you're thinking that the idea of world peace, or the radical idea of world peace, is a utopia. So, I think, but let's see what that means. So, premise that leads to war is that the development of humanity depends on the division of humanity into different directions, different forms of life, under the shield of armed states. So then we would say, the terrible price that we pay for this divergence, for this dialectic, is war, or the possibility of war. But there are antidotes to war, although they're incomplete. So what have we learned in our recent experience of the 20th century? We've learned that actually, for global governance, there's only one thing that works, which is cooperative coalitions among states. Nothing else works. So the idea of a world government, or the United Nations as a world government, doesn't work. The United Nations is paralyzed. And where it works is as an umbrella organization for coalitions among states, as in the climate discussion. Now, these coalitions can be of different kinds. There are regional coalitions like the European Union. There are functional coalitions of states that have similar functions in the global order, like the G7 or the G20. And what is most promising are their special purpose coalitions. States get together to resolve problems that they can't solve alone, either to create global goods or to prevent global harms. it's not true that there's a choice between war and empire, universal empire. If you say the worst, the danger of war, the possibility of war, is less of an evil than a universal empire would be. Therefore, we have to allow for this divergence of states, and we have to deal with the danger that results. Now, then a world of problems arises. And it's not going to be clear who the villains and the heroes are in that moment. But that's the stuff that we begin to deal with. So it seems to me that the moral discussions we have would be the moral equivalent to that kind of political discussion. That's how I'm thinking of it. That's the role of the hopeful one.
Yes, please.
What happens to movements of justice if we take Schopenhauer seriously?
Again, could you use a
If,
microphone? And there's this.
what happens to movements of justice if we take Schopenhauer seriously?
What was the movement?
Oh, what happens to movements of social justice if we take Schopenhauer seriously?
Well, why? Because it's not
Well,
obvious.
if he says striving causes suffering, then what happens to those who don't have the luxury to withdraw
To withdraw.
into asceticism and detachment and holiness?
Has to be struggle. I mean, that's my perspective in this discussion. Remember the starting point that I would recommend from my standpoint is the last 3 centuries of humanity have been this struggle over a revolutionary project. So we've discussed in this course the spiritual revolutions that produced what are now the world religions. Those took place 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and ran over a 1,000-year period. In the last 3 centuries, there's a different kind of revolution. It's a secular, usually a secular revolution, not in a theological vocabulary. And it's had these 2 sides. It's had the political side, carried by the doctrines of liberalism, socialism, and democracy, and with a promise. The promise has been to lift the grid of division and hierarchy weighing on humanity, especially the grid of the class structure. Insisting, for example, that democracy is not compatible with class. And then it's had the other side, which is the personalist side, which is the message that the ordinary man and woman is in the end not so ordinary after all. That the ordinary man can rise to a life of broader capacity, capability, intensity, and scope, and have the adventures promised by romanticism. And we know that the forms are inadequate, but the soap operas, the popular music, resonates throughout the world, is heard and seen in every village, in every slum in the world. So this revolution, this is about morality. This is the moral promise. Now, this project, this revolutionary project, I say, remains the most powerful project in the world. It has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. So it continues to command the agenda of humanity. But it's now in this paradoxical position of being both strong and weak. It's strong because it still commands the agenda, but it's weak because its votaries, its champions, no longer know what its next steps should be. On either the political side or the personalist side. So from my standpoint, I see the topic in this course as being the next steps on the personalist side, rather than the political side, with which we're more familiar, because that's the language of politics, ideology, and so forth. So what's the next step on the ethical side? And so we're going to have this discussion now in the second half of the course about the two main ethical projects in the contemporary world. One, an ethic of self-fashioning and non-conformity, and the other, an ethic of responsibility, of solidarity. And both of these ethics are headquartered in one of the two great superpowers of the world, the United States and in China. And their weakest points result from their associations with these two powers. So let's say that's the dust of history. What the features that they have as a result of this association. So we have to take out the dust of history and reinvent them. Now, do I think we will implement them and synthesize them once we have reconstructed them? No, I don't. I don't think we'll ever reconstruct them. I think that's not how it's likely to happen. The way it's likely to happen is that we will invent new divisions and new contrasts so that the debates of the next century will be different from the debates of the past century. But they'll have the same general character. That's how I see it. But the interest then is to continue the revolution by reinventing it, because that's the only way in which it can live. The moral revolution and the political revolution. I don't think that the revolutions of this kind, either political or moral, can prosper if they have the same content or the same form as they had in the past 2 or 3 centuries. But once again, that's the perspective of hope. The perspective of hope is the perspective of reinvention.
Well, and on this point, let me also say a few words about the reinvention and rereading that Schopenhauer's doing, because I think this is precisely to the point. So I do agree. I mean, one of the key differences with what we were discussing last week with Buddhism and what Schopenhauer's doing with his rereading is, remember last week we were discussing this focus on the suffering we are constantly causing, that we fail to notice, and we cause it to a significant degree because we create these worlds in which we define ourselves as a self, we define our entire lives in terms of fulfilling our desires as a self, not recognizing the incredible suffering we're doing. And as we noted, Buddhism ups the ante on this dramatically by saying the consequences of our actions, the suffering we are causing, in other words, play out for lives, eons and eons and eons of lives. And the fact that I am here, foolishly thinking of me as this self is in fact a consequence of all of the sufferings that I have been causing for eons of previous lives. Which means, as we noted last week, for Buddhism, the withdrawal that you do is a withdrawal that's trying to break the self, and to the degree to which you can begin to do so is the degree to which you see the suffering we're causing, you see the suffering we're causing each other, and the sense is it would lead to an immediate compassion toward living creatures, seeing the suffering they're undergoing, and if you reach an extreme level, you then try to act to cease the suffering of others, including doing things that those of us who are not so disciplined could never imagine doing. But even then, the argument is we, less disciplined, begin to do it in our mundane lives, working over hopefully eons of lifetimes to the point where we could do something dramatic, setting oneself on fire, etc. And I say all of this in full agreement. So part of what's so fascinating in Schopenhauer's rereading is he cuts out, well, by definition, reincarnation, so that is not there. The whole notion of karma reread is the consequences of the sufferings we are causing through these many lifetimes. He, of course, takes out. And the main concern becomes, yes, he sees the horrible suffering we're inflicting, but for him, and I'll use your words, I think that captures it, the solution is withdrawal. And so he wants to withdraw. I do think you're absolutely right. He has an extreme, I'll use your words, I think it captures it perfectly, pessimism about social justice movements that we could do that would only create more suffering in his mind. And this plays out in his life, and he literally withdraws. And it's fascinating because, of course, from a Buddhist perspective, his final withdrawal into his mansion and being served by servants, that's Siddhartha in his palace. that's the beginning of the Buddha story that the Buddha, of course, must reject precisely because he seeks enlightenment, and he seeks enlightenment and achieves it, he has this universal compassion. So I say all of this to note, exactly to underline your point, Schopenhauer's rereading, I do think leads to a withdrawal, and conclude with a question on these remarks. In our rereadings, if we want to take these ideas seriously, I would note the danger of Schopenhauer's mode of rereading, and then of course it would raise a larger question for us if we are not committed to the notion of reincarnation, if we're not committed to a notion of karma reread as eons, of the consequences of our actions playing out over eons. Are there ways we could reread Buddhism that would still maintain that sense that's so strong in the tradition that you can't simply withdraw, you must be actively engaged, again, a very different way than as we've seen in Christianity, in a very different way than we'll see in a few weeks when we get to Confucianism. So one of those big questions, as Roberto has said, about how one rereads these early traditions and the tremendous potentialities and potential dangers of the ways we do so.
Now, I think that in this kind of discussion that you propose, there will be disagreements about reality, about what's feasible, what's, and that goes to the question that you raised there about realism. So, for example, is it realistic to suppose that 2,000 years ago there were prophets, there were Jewish prophets, there were Christian prophets, but that's just the past. It's some past stage of humanity. And are there no prophets now? Are the gates of prophecy closed or are they open? I would say they're open forever. And it's just that prophecy will take a new form. Not only will the content of the prophecy be different, but the form will be different. But the idea that prophecy was a phenomenon of societies 2,000 years ago, when they can't arise now, doesn't make any sense to me. There's no reason to believe that. They'll be false, they'll have a completely different form to be able to resonate today. We won't recognize them as the same. But the fundamental direction of transformation, of subversion of the imagination of alternatives will continue forever. Now, and that then holds also for these moral alternatives that we're considering. So it's like, that's an idea, that realism is the reproduction of the present. Realism is having some view of transformation. The only way we understand anything is to understand how it changes. There's no other, that's the whole nature of insight. If we don't have any view of how it changes, we don't understand it altogether. And then all we can do is retrospective rationalization, which is a large part of conventional academic work. And I think that's the power of philosophy is to wage war against rational reconstruction, retrospective rationalization. And that's why Hegel said, accurately, philosophy is revolutionary even when it seems to be reactionary, because it presents a whole view of things, and even if the view is infected with the evil of retrospective rationalization, just by seeing the phenomenon as a whole, you begin to have the idea that it can be subverted and replaced. Hegel's own philosophy is one of the best examples of that. Hegel's own philosophy was on its surface reactionary. But look at what Karl Marx did to it.
Please.
What do you see as the primary obstacles to applying the dualism that we seem capable to apply other human beings and extending that to other beings of the world and the world in
The
general?
dual aspect theory.
Yes,
What's the obstacle to generalizing that?
yes.
Well, don't you think that Schopenhauer's fundamental move is somewhat arbitrary? I mean, he dictates the solution, but he doesn't argue it. So he just says, the truth is that we don't have, it's not obvious how we can do what he recommends that we do. He just says that we should do it by force. But how can we internalize how can we view the whole world the way we view ourselves, as he says, from the inside? What would that mean? We don't have this access to the interiority of the stars of the universe. This is an imagination, it's a fiction. So it's the philosophical equivalent to bad utopianism, because it doesn't show us the intermediate steps by which we would get from here to there. How would we do it? Like,
No, I fully agree, but did you want to attempt?
I mean,
Yeah, please, yes, please.
my initial thought was that part of it is that we seem to be bogged down in materiality and that we're constantly looking for proof and evidence to rationalize our decision making. So I think that leads to a lack of hope, and if we are able to somehow foster this hope in possibilities that we can't fully rationalize, then perhaps it can be more attainable.
but let me give you an example of a kind of philosophical difference. So I said there were these two dominant global traditions of philosophy. The philosophy of deep structure, or the Greek philosophy of being, and the philosophy of the timeless one. There's then this third position. And I said, well, let's develop the third position. Third position is temporal naturalism that says everything is transient. The laws of nature change, the types of being change, but no less real on that account. We disassociate the temporal character of being lack of reality. Now, then you look at the philosophers who profess this position. Who are they? So Hegel, in a sense, in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Whitehead, Bergson, theologians like Teilhard de Chardin, the Catholic Church. And in every single case, the philosopher spoils his project by creating a protagonist, a hero of his transformative narrative. So, for Hegel, it was Geist. For Bergson, it was Elan Vital, and so forth. So, you could rewrite the phenomenology as the adventures of Geist, the adventures of Elan Vital. And so, they seem to take back with one hand what they've given with another. So with one hand, they've given this idea of contingency, temporality, openness. Then they take it back. They say, the story is already written, and I'll tell you how the adventure ends. Right?
Oh, completely.
So, what's the matter? What's the problem with that? Why do they have to do this? So why don't they just carry the logic of their position to the hills and keep going? So have their story of temporal naturalism without the hero and without the pre-written narrative, and then would be much more powerful. So I think that the transformative projects that we have in the world are all intermingled with these cognitive ambitions. And that's the genuine role of philosophy. That's the most defensible idea that we could have today of philosophy. Philosophy is to do that. Philosophy is to say, we'll have ambitious projects against the dominant methods of the current disciplines. What's the problem in the social sciences? The problem in the social sciences is each of them severs the link between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible. Each of them does it in a different way. It's exactly like Anna Karenina begins with a statement that all happy families are alike. Every happy family is unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Yet, the happiness of the social science is the distinct ways in which they sever this link between insight and the actual and imagination of the possible. So, what's the role of philosophy? The role of philosophy is to insist on these projects and say, the human mind, our ability to understand the world, is not exhausted by these established specialties. There is a reserve power of the human mind to turn the specialties against themselves, as in this idea that we wouldn't allow the exponents of temporal naturalism to undermine their own project by taking back with one hand what they've given us with another. That's what philosophy should be. It should be this, the mind in war, in this, insisting on carrying out radically the logic of its oppositions and showing how you don't have to interpret them the way they interpret themselves. So look at physics, look at I think there are two great crises now in thought. One in the social sciences and one in the natural sciences. The crisis in the social sciences is fundamentally rooted in the lack of a credible theory of structures or regimes. So that's the heart of a social science. This was Aristotle's theory. Aristotle was the one who first put it at the center of political and social thought. The regime, there's a typology of regimes. Each regime can be defined institutionally and spiritually. Montesquieu in the modern age, and then Karl Marx, whose theory of regimes was the consummate achievement of European social theory. And no one believes anymore in their theories of regimes. And their theories of regimes have this defect. So, Marx, the essence of the modern theory of regimes is that the regimes are a kind of frozen fighting. They're not natural. It's like a game of musical chairs. The music is the practical and visionary strife that goes on in society. So when the music stops, people sit down on the chairs are the regimes of the structure. The chairs are the solid, frozen form of fighting. And that's the basis of the theory of regimes. But the Marxist theory of regimes then had this idea, this is a structures of frozen fighting. But then it surrounded the insight that these structures are artifacts, they're our creations. As Vico said, we can understand them because we made them. And then they become like natural objects that we look at from the outside. So Marx's idea is necessitarian ideas. That there's a menu, a short list of regimes, predefined. Second, that every regime is an indivisible system. So there's a binary view of politics. Politics is either reform or revolution. Either total substitution of a system or management of a system. And the third premise is that there are laws governing the succession of regimes. So if there are laws, that means that history has a project for us. We don't have to have a project. We can't have a project because there's a project waiting for us, which history has defined. It's all wrong. So the role of philosophy is to engage in that combat and not suppress the theory of regimes, but change the theory of regimes. Now, in the natural sciences, there's another problem. That the way physics and physics has developed in the age of quantum mechanics and relativity is that physics has now practically abolished the acceptance of the idea of time, causality, and laws, right? Physics now is all about structure and not about time, not about history. There's a completely contingent fact about the evolution of 20th century science that's associated with this, which is that the discovery of the historical character of the universe took place in the 1920s after relativity and quantum mechanics had already emerged. If the historical character of the universe had been established before, so it might have evolved in a completely different way. Now, here's the problem, which is that this development of natural science began with Galileo and the quantification of natural science. Eventually leads to the 20th century unraveling of the acceptance of time, the acceptance of causality, and therefore of transformation. in the world, how we understand transformation. Now, if you pull out from natural science this element of temporality and causation, you're left with a natural science that can't be translated into the language of our human experience. Now, the truth of the propositions of contemporary physics is locked in to their mathematical formulation. Because you pulled out what the philosophers since Kant considered to be inseparable from human experience, which is temporality. Now, maybe the world is that way, but we shouldn't make it seem that it is that way without a fight, because there are huge consequences that follow from this abandonment, in which we think mathematics holds the torch, mathematics is the prophet of science. So what I'm advocating as the cause of philosophy is philosophy be the custodian of these ambitions, to try and avoid the separation of our knowledge of the natural universe from our experience, organized around time, and in society to insist on the primacy of structure. Otherwise, we have a kind of social science like the one you see around you in this university, which is all about the retrospective rationalization of structure, and not about the transformation of structure, the creation of alternative structure. So I do want to make a recommendation about your studies associated with this, which is I want everyone to study the history of philosophy. That's what I recommend. The most common defect in the education of educated people today is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy, which is the history of fundamental ideas of our civilization. And this can easily be remedied. So again, in the spirit of hope, I'm suggesting a practical remedy. In a single summer, you can read the 12 volumes of Cobblestone's History of Philosophy, which is the best philosophy, history of philosophy in English, because it's the least opinionated, and it's just a straightforward account of the doctrines of philosophers, right?
Absolutely.
You can buy it on Amazon and read it in a single summer. And you can combine that method with another method. Now, first of all, the academics, the professors will tell you, don't read secondary works. It's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Don't pay attention to them. Those are the bad advisors. And the second method is to choose one philosopher and read everything he ever wrote. Inform your mind intentions of his in a dialogue. And don't choose necessarily a philosopher who you like. Choose the one whose ideas are antagonistic to your own inclination. You can choose someone you like. If I chose someone I like, I would choose Aristotle or Hegel. If I want someone I don't like, I would choose Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer's philosophy is the inverse of mine. So that's another criteria that you can have for electing a philosopher. And what's the reason to do this? The reason to do this is the fundamental reason for your education, which is to acquire the equipment with which to turn against the ideas of your contemporaries. of their place, of their time, of their generation. We don't need higher levels of education to be drilled in the conventional ideas of the people around you. It's the opposite. You need to get away from them. And the university is not a good place to do that. Any university. So the further you go in your education, the less the education can depend on school-like courses. School is good for some things and bad for many other things. So what it's good for is to develop particular skills, like how to solve problems in mathematical physics, how to read German, and so forth. It's good for that. It's not good to teach you to think. It has nothing to do with thinking. And so for that, you have to educate yourself. If you can find in the course of your formal education a few people who can inspire you, you should judge yourselves as exceptionally lucky, because no one can expect that. You have to be prepared to educate yourself, and that requires tenacity and courage. Courage is not the highest virtue, but it's the enabling virtue. It's the first virtue of the agent and of the thinker. Without courage, all other virtues are rendered infantile.
Oh, and Jensen, did you have a question? Please, please, yes.
I was just wondering, in Schopenhauer's view, as happiness as something negative and just like the absence of crime. I was just wondering if he sees any like intrinsic goodness or positivity in reality,
Any positivity in?
Intrinsic.
or like any intrinsic goodness in
Any
reality.
virtue
Oh,
in
any intrinsic goodness in reality? Was that the, yes, yes.
You mean the view, whether Schopenhauer's view of happiness as a negative state is compatible with acknowledging a positive aspect of the world?
Yeah. Does he see like anything in the world as being positive?
Well, I don't know. I haven't thought about whether that would be compatible with anything in the world is positive. But that negative view of happiness is certainly intimately linked to the idea that the world is a mess. The world is terrible. Right? That was the summary of that passage that I read. It's beautiful to behold, but it's terrible to be. How can it be more definitive than that? So what one would say in the spirit of the discussion we had about fatalism and hope is that that's a comment made by someone who has not spent enough time trying to transform things. Because otherwise he would be more hopeful. Yes.
So when we talk about the conduct of life, it seems like we presuppose like that to perceive the world shapes how we conduct our life. And I know from studying with Michael that in the Confucian tradition, there are ritual practices that are designed to like sort of throw down our defenses and gradually reshape perception itself. And I was wondering if there are any figures in the Western tradition who offer something similar, not just moral arguments or just more actual disciplines or practices aimed at expanding our perception and transforming the self.
I didn't hear that. Help me.
Oh, sure. So the question was, are there figures in the Western tradition who are focused on, unlike Schopenhauer in other words, on opening our perception, opening possibilities, and transforming the world? I would just say wait till next week, but
all the great novelists. That's what our literature is. I think that the great European novels, the great novels, are about that. They're about these possible lives. Yeah. And so they help us deal with this poisonous aspect of faith, right? Because we think we each have a genetic and a social fate, and tempted to resign ourselves to it. And the reading of these novels is an education in the discovery of possibility, possible experience. So we're able to imagine ourselves as going through different experiences. And to some extent neutralize this fatalistic task. And I think even Schopenhauer would recognize that the value of that for us is to excite life, to allow us to come into the possession of life. Because it's only through struggle that we feel that we acquire life. And so alongside the slogan of throwing down our shield, of making ourselves vulnerable, the second slogan that I would elect would be living in such a way that we can die only once. And to do that, we have to engage in these transformative struggles.
Wonderful. And then let me use that question to say a few words about what we will be doing the next 2 weeks, because they will be directly on this. So next week, we will turn to the Romantic tradition, looking at 2 very different, we'll come back to that question, figures, Emerson and Nietzsche, with their attempts to reread the Christian tradition. They will strongly be emphasizing claims of radical transformation. You will see they will lean strongly into the notion of creative infinity, very much pushing against, going back to what we were mentioning a few weeks ago, the Christian notion of love. We will discuss the powers and dangers of those approaches, particularly that of Nietzsche. And the week after that, we will turn to Confucian approaches, which will offer a very different vision of transformation and a very different sense of what cultivation could mean. And then we will be using those to jump into the last part of our course, where we will be reconstructing these traditions and ask, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the readings we've seen so far, and how can we reconstruct them potentially in a way that will open up yet more possibilities going forward. So thank you all so much. We look forward to some discussion next week, and then of course it'll be spring break, but after that to Confucianism as we continue our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.